That morning, nobody knew the greatest Viking invasion in history would end with the death of the Viking Age itself. September 25th, 1066 AD. Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king, stood on English soil, commanding the largest northern army ever assembled. 10,000 warriors from Norway, Denmark, and the Orkney Islands, veterans who had fought from Constantinople to Iceland. Men whose axes had carved empires from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Behind them lay the smoking ruins of Fulford, where they had crushed the largest English army Yorkshire could muster. Ahead lay York itself, defenseless and ready for plunder. The invasion that was supposed to restore Viking dominance over England seemed unstoppable. Harold, who had served as a Varangian guard, who had fought for the Byzantine emperor, who had conquered half of Norway through pure military genius, commanded forces that made him the most powerful Viking leader since Ragnar Lothbrok. But as his army rested in the fields around Stamford Bridge, confident in their overwhelming superiority, none of them suspected they were living through the final hours of an age that had defined northern Europe for 3 centuries. The Viking invasion of 1066 represented everything the northern world could throw against Anglo-Saxon England. Harald Hardrada was not just another raider seeking easy plunder. He was the most experienced warrior king in Europe, a man whose military career had taken him from the fords of Norway to the palaces of Constantinople. His claim to the English throne was not based on ambition, but on careful legal arguments that made his invasion seem justified, rather than merely opportunistic. The alliance he had forged with Tustig Godwinson, Harold of England's own brother, gave the invasion political legitimacy that previous Viking raids had lacked. Most importantly, the army he commanded represented the culmination of Viking military evolution. Professional soldiers rather than seasonal raiders, coordinated strategy rather than individual heroism. This was supposed to be the invasion that finally established permanent Viking rule over the richest kingdom in northern Europe. But Harald Hardrada carried more than military power across the North Sea. He carried the accumulated expectations of a civilization that had defined itself through conquest and expansion for 300 years. The longships that brought his army to English shores carried the dreams of every Viking warrior who had ever imagined claiming foreign kingdoms through superior courage and steel. The banners that flew above his forces represented not just Norwegian ambition, but the fundamental Viking belief that the strong deserved to rule the weak, regardless of previous political arrangements. The invasion was not just about conquering England, it was about proving that the Viking way of life remained superior to the settled Christian civilization that had replaced warrior culture throughout most of Europe. King Harold Godwinson of England faced the greatest crisis of his reign when news reached him that Harald Hardrada had landed with the largest Viking force ever seen in English waters. The English king, who had spent months preparing for William of Normandy's expected invasion, suddenly found himself fighting a two-front war that threatened to tear his kingdom apart. The victory at Fulford had demonstrated that even the most experienced English forces could not match Viking military superiority in conventional battle. Yorkshire, the richest province in northern England, lay defenseless before an enemy who had never shown mercy to conquered territories. The political situation was equally desperate. Tostig's rebellion had given the invasion legitimacy among English nobles who opposed Harold's rule. For the first time since Alfred the Great, an English king faced the possibility that Viking conquest might actually succeed. The forced march that brought Harold's army north from London revealed the desperation driving English strategy. 240 miles covered in 4 days, a pace that left men collapsing from exhaustion, but brought the only force capable of challenging Harald Hardrada to Yorkshire before the Viking army could consolidate its gains. The English soldiers, who stumbled into position around Stamford Bridge on September 25th, were not the fresh, disciplined troops that had defeated Danish invasions in previous generations. They were exhausted men who had been pushed beyond normal human endurance, because their king understood that England's survival depended on preventing Harold from establishing permanent control over northern England. The Norwegian camp that Harold's scouts observed around Stamford Bridge revealed the fundamental mistake that would cost Harold everything he had achieved. The Viking army, confident after their victory at Fulford, had dispersed across the Yorkshire countryside to gather supplies and enjoy the spoils of conquest. Warriors who should have been maintaining military discipline were instead celebrating prematurely, assuming that English resistance had been crushed permanently. Most fatally, Harold had left much of his armor and heavy weapons aboard the longships moored miles away at Rickhall, believing that no English force could threaten his position quickly enough to matter. The greatest military mind in Viking history had made the classic error of assuming that victory in one battle guaranteed victory in the campaign. The English approach to Stamford Bridge demonstrated tactical innovations that Harold's conventional Viking thinking had not anticipated. Harold Godwinson divided his forces into multiple columns that could attack simultaneously from different directions, preventing the Vikings from forming the shield walls that had made them dominant in previous engagements. English cavalry, which had proven ineffective against organized Viking infantry, was deployed in coordination with foot soldiers in ways that maximized mobility while maintaining striking power. Most importantly, the English attack was timed to catch the Viking army at the moment of maximum vulnerability, when overconfidence had replaced military discipline and celebration had replaced strategic preparation. The Battle of Stamford Bridge began with a sight that shocked every veteran warrior who witnessed it. 300 English horsemen thundering across the bridge that gave the battle its name, charging directly into the center of a Viking army that outnumbered them more than 30 to 1. The attack was not tactical madness, but calculated psychology designed to shatter Viking morale at the moment when Harold's forces were least prepared to respond effectively. English commanders understood that Viking military supremacy depended on maintaining the initiative through aggressive action. By launching the first attack, Harold's forces seized psychological advantages that numbers alone could not overcome. The legendary stand of the lone Viking warrior on Stamford Bridge became the symbol of individual courage, confronting historical inevitability. The unnamed Norwegian soldier, who held the narrow bridge against the entire English army, killing dozens of attackers with his great axe, represented everything heroic about Viking military culture. His defiance delayed the English advance long enough for Harold's scattered forces to begin organizing defensive positions. His death, when an English soldier floated beneath the bridge and speared him from below, marked the moment when Viking individual heroism was finally overcome by English tactical innovation. The bridge that had been defended by one man's courage was open to 300 English cavalry, who would destroy the last great Viking army. Harald Hardrada's death in the battle that followed shocked the Viking world more than the military defeat itself. The king, who had never lost a campaign, who had commanded the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, who had conquered territories from Russia to the Mediterranean, fell to an English arrow that found the gap between his helmet and mail shirt. His final words, according to witnesses, were an order for his men to maintain their shield wall formation, even as English cavalry broke through their ranks. The death of the last Viking king was not just a military casualty, but the end of an era when northern warriors could claim any throne they were strong enough to hold. The collapse of Viking resistance after Harold's death revealed how completely the northern military system depended on individual leadership rather than institutional strength. The army that had seemed invincible while commanded by their legendary king disintegrated into confused fragments when that leadership was eliminated. Warriors, who had fought courageously under Harold's banner, fled the battlefield when they realized their cause had died with their commander. The disciplined formations that had crushed English resistance at Fulford dissolved into panicked retreat as men sought to reach their ships before English pursuit could complete their destruction. The pursuit that followed the Viking collapse became one of the most complete military disasters in medieval history. English cavalry, freed from the constraint of attacking organized Viking positions, hunted fleeing warriors across the Yorkshire countryside with ruthless efficiency. Men who had survived decades of warfare from the Baltic to the Black Sea died in muddy fields far from the sea that had carried them to glory in a dozen kingdoms. The survivors who reached the longships at Rickel were so few that 24 vessels were sufficient to carry home an army that had arrived in 300 ships. Young Olaf Haraldsson, Harold's son, led the pitiful remnants of the Norwegian expedition back across the North Sea, with the weight of absolute failure crushing his adolescent shoulders. The prince who had expected to inherit conquered English territories instead carried news that would transform Scandinavian political calculations for generations. The invasion that was supposed to prove Viking superiority had instead demonstrated that the age of northern expansion was over. The military innovations that had made Vikings dominant for 3 centuries were no longer sufficient against enemies who had learned to counter traditional Viking advantages through superior organization and tactical flexibility. The immediate consequence of Stamford Bridge was the elimination of Viking England as a political possibility. For 300 years, northern rulers had been able to claim English kingdoms through military conquest. Harald Hardrada's defeat established that such conquests were no longer feasible against English forces that had evolved beyond the military systems Vikings had traditionally dominated. The dream of permanent Scandinavian rule over the richest territories in northern Europe died in the fields around Stamford Bridge, along with the warriors who had carried it across the sea. But the deeper significance of the battle extended far beyond immediate military consequences. The Viking Age, which had begun with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD, ended with Harold's death on September 25, 1066. The cultural system that had defined Scandinavian civilization for centuries, based on the assumption that warrior prowess could overcome any obstacle, had been proven obsolete by enemies who had learned to fight more intelligently rather than more heroically. The transformation was not just military, but psychological. Vikings could no longer believe that courage and individual skill guaranteed victory against more organized opponents. The political ramifications reached every corner of the northern European world. Scandinavian kings, who had planned their own English invasions, abandoned those plans when news of Harold's defeat reached their courts. The precedent that Viking armies could conquer established kingdoms was replaced by the reality that such armies could be destroyed by prepared defenders fighting on familiar ground. The balance of power that had favored aggressive northerners over settled Christian populations was permanently reversed. From 1066 forward, Viking expansion would be constrained by the knowledge that military superiority was no longer guaranteed. The 300 English soldiers who destroyed 10,000 Viking warriors at Stamford Bridge had accomplished more than a tactical victory. They had ended an age. They had proven that the future belonged to organizational effectiveness rather than individual heroism. They had demonstrated that military evolution favored systematic thinking over traditional valor. The charge across Stamford Bridge was not just an attack on a Viking army, but an assault on the assumptions that had defined medieval warfare since the collapse of Rome. The victory that ended the Viking Age marked the beginning of the military systems that would dominate Europe until the introduction of gunpowder warfare centuries later.